Hello, my name is Alexis. I'm going to be doing my project on childhood trauma and mental illness. So one of the big question is how does childhood trauma become a result to suffering with mental illness or addiction later in life? One of the biggest components is a loss of attachment styles between the caregiver and the offspring. This love and connection is extremely powerful in this need for attachment. This attachment between the caregiver and the offspring, it's non-negotiable, it's essential for survival. And in the event that child experiences traumatic situations in early childhood development, this can affect relationships with others and including themselves. This disconnection from emotions because of traumatic experiences, they are sometimes unable to regulate their emotions, and later in adulthood, they feel like the life that they have is unmanageable and the world is unmanageable, and they have a difficulty living life on life's terms without suffering with substance abuse disorders or mental health disorders. Because of this loss of authenticity, the individual will begin sometimes searching for a sense of relief because of that lack of attention that they received from the caregiver. They'll start looking for comfort in substances, relationships, alcohol. So, also, additionally, when a child suffers from traumatic events, this can neurologically affect the way neuron receptors respond to each other, and this will cause mental health disorders. So, trauma during childhood and the risk for potential mental illness in adulthood. Studies suggest that individuals that suffer from childhood trauma are at a potential risk for suffering with mental illness later in life. There was a study done by the Hospital Del Mar Research Institute that examined individuals that suffered with emotional, physical, and sexual abuse in early childhood development. And the study concluded that um, they can potentially suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder, post traumatic stress disorder, BPD, anxiety, or depression. Um, the study also concluded that individuals that experience some sort of traumatic or life threatening event are 15 times more likely to suffer with borderline personality disorder. I'm going to discuss BPD in a later slide. Additionally, with those traumatic events experienced in childhood, they can also suffer with possible brain damage from those traumatic events. So, going to brain damage, one of the things that is affected, or a couple of the things that are affected rather, are the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. When a child is abused continuously for a period of time, this physically alters many parts of the brain at once. So, with the prefrontal cortex, this limits brain development for the child to make decisions or evaluate situations that are potentially harmful because of that trauma. Along with the hippocampus, traumatic memories trigger that child for an extended period of time. With damages with the hippocampus, this becomes an issue with them regulating emotions. The child can feel that they are in that traumatic event even in adulthood, since a lot of that the feelings of the traumatic event are stored in the amygdala gland. So triggers like smell, speech, or noise can send that child or adult into fight or flight response. So I'm going to talk about fight or flight more in a next following couple slides. So again, going back to the amygdala gland, the feelings of that traumatic event are stored in the amygdala. So trauma can alter the neurological responses or regions of the brain responsible for processing fear, stress, and emotional regulation. With damages of the prefrontal cortex, this is a potential risk for the person making risky decisions. So in a way, the brain becomes a little bit disorganized because of those traumatic events. And the body might respond to the trauma for survival, but the neurological pathways are affected, shutting down portions of the brain that are responsible for higher reasoning. Here are some statistical data showing that a number of cases of child abuse in the United States. And the study suggested that individuals are abused, especially children between the ages of 1 to 9 years old. The abuse is because the parent sometimes suffers with mental illness or substance abuse. The parent can feel like there's a lack of support and they're unable to cope with life stressors or raising that child. There's an expectation also that when they abuse that child, that this will eliminate unwanted behaviors exhibited by the child. Quickly on that last little comment, so sometimes this is generational trauma that not only is the child being abused, but this is an issue traumatically with the whole entire family unit. Um, the child's being abused. That parent was once a child who was also abused by their parents. So treatment is necessary for the whole entire family unit. Not only does the child suffer, but also the family suffers. So getting more in depth about theories of attachment by John Bowlby. He believed that strong emotional attachment was vital for childhood development. The sense of bonding between a parent, therefore, the child looks for security from that caregiver to explore. The relationship between the parent and the child translates also into relationships into adulthood. So, for example, if a child is experiencing neglectful parenting styles from the caregiver, the child can feel like they don't have enough emotional support from that caregiver. Therefore, this lack of support is a traumatic event in itself. And they're having issues in early childhood development with regulating their emotions, understanding life stressors because they're being neglected by their parent. And John Bowlby really saw that attachment was multifaceted, that this this type of attachment involved a variety of developmental mechanisms over the first year of life in early childhood development. So attachment styles are really important in the way that you raise children. So again, going back to these attachment styles, I have secure attachment, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, and disorganized attachment. Um, I've included how once these attachment styles are used and they're not used in a productive manner where the child feels like they're not safe, these are the results of those type of attachment styles between a caregiver and the offspring. I want to talk a little bit about disorganized attachment. This is when a child is fearful of the mother slash caregiver. On the other hand, they rely on that caregiver for survival. So one of the biggest examples that I found during my research was the Gabriel Fernandez case. Gabriel Fernandez was 8 years old and was emotionally and physically abused over the course of 8 months. He unfortunately wasn't removed from the house because Child Protective Services had a lack of resources. But the reason why this is one example of disorganized attachment is because sometimes the children are abused to the point that their abusers tell them not to report this abuse. And because they see their parent as their superhero, their caregiver, the one that gives them love, the one that gives them housing, food, and a variety of different things, that sometimes there's a sense of reliance with that abuser. And they simply don't want to see their parents arrested, but they just want the abuse to stop. So again, this is an example of disorganized attachment where the child is fearful of the mother slash caregiver. On the other hand, they rely on that caregiver for survival. So moving forward to Basil van der Kolk and his body, and I mean his book about the body keeps the score, written in 2014. The author addresses traumatic suffering, that an individual doesn't only suffer in the mind, but rather the body has a physical response to that trauma. And he goes in depth about how trauma carries various symptoms that are associated to neglect. And how sometimes when someone suffers with post-traumatic stress disorder, they will isolate themselves and avoid daily activities that used to bring them joy, because that traumatic event is stored in the amygdala. Therefore, those nervous systems physically react, causing a fight or flight response, which I'll discuss in the next following slides. So he also discusses about exposure therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy as beneficial factors to overcoming and healing from those once traumatic events, rewiring the brain, um, basically managing emotional regulation so that people that suffer with post-traumatic stress disorder or childhood trauma as a result to other mental health disorders can live a normal and regular life. So going into fight or flight response, which is another correlation to the body keeps the score. Fight or flight freeze response is a response to stressful or traumatic situations. Cognitively, this is a response to survival. So messages are sent down from the nervous systems to the muscles to perform this physical response to the event. Why this is so important is because not only is the mind affected from the traumatic response, the body also keeps the score. So in the event that trauma is experienced, this can affect these responses. For example, flight will be shut off when faced with traumatic events. So scientifically, um, beginning with the hypothalamus, this sends a signal to the adrenal gland, and these glands are connected to the nervous system of the brain, sending adrenaline and endorphins to the liver, then through the heart, increasing the heart rate, moving blood to the muscles for that physical reaction. So going back a little bit to borderline personality disorder, when we were talking about that research study, um, borderline personality disorder is a mental illness, and people who struggle with BPD have a hard time regulating their emotions, also personal identity, understanding themselves, and there's just this intense fear of not being accepted or abandoned. And research suggests that individuals that suffer with BPD have once experienced traumatic or life-threatening events in early childhood development. Additionally, with BPD, sometimes these individuals in adulthood who experience childhood trauma also suffer from severe anxiety, depression, or obsessive compulsive disorder, leading to dual diagnosis. And many believe that these traumatic events or experiences correlate with trauma-based disorders. So moving on a little bit. So I want to talk a little bit about childhood trauma and substance abuse. The brain is shaped by early childhood development and our environment, and also these attachment styles that we experience when we are a developing child. And the circuits of the brain are predicted by our impulses. Therefore, there might be an inability to process that trauma. Therefore, survivors of substances, sorry, therefore, survivors of trauma can sometimes abuse those substances. And what they're really looking for is a short term relief to a long period of time of trauma. So, these short term relief with opioids or marijuana or a variety of different substances can lead to the adult having negative side effects of addiction. And going a little bit back to attachment and why this is important is because humans are creatures of attachment. So endorphins are released during childhood development between the caregiver and the offspring, and with this lack of attachment, the endorphin systems aren't developed, resulting in a reliance to substances such as opioids. So there's many correlations between individuals that suffer with childhood trauma also end up abusing substances later in life. So again, issues with attachment with the caregiver is one of the reasons for a person abusing substances. Sometimes they are looking for sort of a reliance and acceptance because they fear abandonment so much because of their childhood trauma that they'll gain friendships and relationships and kind of have a little bit of a codependency. And within those relationships, they'll have access to drugs or substances and they'll suppress that trauma and continue using those drugs to numb out. And these addictive behaviors are later exhibited sometimes in adulthood. And again, with BPD and substance abuse disorder, there are treatments. For example, substance abuse disorder, people that suffer with substance abuse disorder can go to AA, inpatient programs, outpatient programs, and sort out this substance abuse issue. With people that suffer with borderline personality disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, depression, anxiety, EMDR therapy is really good, cognitive behavioral therapy, talking with a counselor, exposure therapy, and in the event that these things can't be cured, there's also medication that can be prescribed from a medical professional. allowing those individuals to have a sense of relief rather than abusing substances. They get that relief in a healthy way so that they can cope with life and life stressors. So, in conclusion, early childhood development is a key component to a healthy, sustainable adulthood. Traumatic events can alter cognitive functions of the child depending on the attachment style experienced during childhood development. Again, many studies suggest that individuals that suffer with trauma in early childhood development resort to substance abuse or suffering from some type of mental health disorder later in life. Um, Without the solution of treatment, this once victimized child can become an adult and suffer from mood regulation and the inability to cope with life stressors. They can also suffer from high levels of anxiety, possible depression, suicidal ideation, because not only does that trauma live in the amygdala gland in variety regions in the brain, but it also lives in the body, and that trauma that's stored in the brain also has a nervous system physical response in the body. So, in conclusion, I want to express that individuals that suffer from trauma, childhood trauma, this isn't a life sentence. There is long-term treatment plans to we rewire the brain and bring in positive coping skills for mood regulation. And the treatment is available for those who are willing to tackle these difficult situations in a constructive manner.